Good evening and welcome everyone to the National Press Club. We are having a lovely book event tonight featuring Washington Post reporter Robert Samuels, who will discuss his book, His Name is George Floyd. I'm Kimberly Adams. I'm co-host of the Marketplace podcast, Make Me Smart, and also a host at Marketplace Tech, which is a business and economy program for public radio. We're looking forward to a robust discussion today here at the Press Club, and we're also happy to take questions from the audience. If you have a question today, please write them on the cards that are on your seats, and you can pass them over to Kate. I want to give a special welcome to everyone here in the room, but also anybody who's watching later online from the Board of Governors at the National Press Club, where I serve as chair. We are very grateful to our members and also to everybody who comes and spends time here at the National Press Club. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020, set off a series of protests in the United States and around the world, awakening millions to the racism and widespread abuses by our nation's police forces. I can't breathe. Those words that Floyd uttered in the last 8 minutes of his life became a rallying cry for protests in the United States and around the world, awakening so many people to this cause of Black Lives Matter and also to the humanity that George Floyd did not have conveyed to him in that moment. Few of us, though, knew anything about the 46 years that George Floyd lived before those final minutes. Our guest today, Washington Post reporter Robert Samuels, and his co-author, Toluse Olorunnipa, Washington Post political and enterprise and investigations reporter, drew on more than 400 interviews with friends and the family who knew George Floyd best and those who were with him when he died. This reporting paints the clearest picture yet that we have of George Floyd, the man, and the societal forces that brought him to that fateful day in May of 2020. The New York Times described the book as a brilliantly revealing portrait of the structures of poverty, land theft, and racism that shaped not only Floyd, but also his kinship networks in the South. Mr. Samuels is a national political enterprise reporter for the Post, and he focuses on the intersection of politics, policy, and people. He previously told stories about life in the district for the Post's social issues team. And before joining the Post in 2011, Mr. Samuels covered politics, poverty, murder, and mayhem at the Miami Herald. We're also pleased to be joined by George A. Jones, CEO of Bread for the City, which is a Washington-based charitable organization that helps low-income residents with food, clothing, medical care, and legal and social services to reduce the burden of poverty, as well as Bread for the City's chief medical officer, Randy Abramson, and who's also an assistant clinical professor at George Washington University's Medical Center. Welcome, everyone, to the club. And so now I'm gonna step down and we're going to get going. Did you have some opening remarks that you'd like to make, Robert?
Sure, if I can do them from my seat.
You're allowed.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. For my colleague Toluse Olorunnipa and I, writing this book was the most vital and important journalism assignment we had ever taken on. It started with a series of stories in the Washington Post in October 2020 that posited the question, who was George Floyd and what was it like to live in his America? Because we wanted readers to understand that this discussion of systemic racism that had started to emanate in our society and in our culture was not a theoretical discussion. It was something that had real consequences for real people. Now, when we started, we had an inkling that George Floyd might have been shaped by some of the ways those institutions were structured through housing and education. and healthcare and criminal justice. What we did not know was that George Floyd's life was emblematic of so many millions of people in this country, largely black, who are still enduring the same inequities that he lived with before he had ever met Derek Chauvin. What we also didn't know was George Floyd was an incredibly dynamic person. He was gregarious, he was godly, he had a faith, he was comical, everyone loved talking about him, and he was complicated. He had a lot of struggles in his life. And we hoped that through telling his story, the story of one man's life, showing the world who he is, we hoped that people who read it would have a better window into who we are as a society, about the prejudices we carry, the prejudices we carry out, and how we might begin to unlock some of those prejudices within ourselves to build a better tomorrow.
Thank you. To start, George and Randy, I'm wondering if you can just give me your thoughts and how you felt reading, or as George and I did, listening to the book. George, why don't you go first?
Sure. No, I mentioned earlier that there were probably 3 times in the book that I cried. I have to confess that. One is obvious during the description of George Floyd's murder, and sort of when it was effectively taking place again in the book. And a little later, Dante, and I don't remember his last name, was also slain in Minnesota. And one of the things that really resonated with me, I am also a mama's boy, and so it didn't escape me that both of them were reaching out for their mother, Dante for his living mother at the end of his life, and Floyd for his deceased mother. And so that was really hard. So this book was really good, and it was very hard as a black man. I think just a U.S. citizen, to be honest with you, it's a hard story. And I guess, and the other thing was that when his great-great-grandfather's property, maybe it was 3 great-grands, property was stolen from him in the Goldsboro, North Carolina county, which is where my people were enslaved, another place where it just sort of really broke my heart to sort of see and listen to how all these elements, when we talk about racial oppression, when we talk about racial inequity, we talk about their narratives, there's policy, there's data, there's practices that sort of you analyze to sort of come up with what systemic racism looked like. There are other elements to it, but those are some of the things. And this book really powerfully sort of lays bare those elements in one life. It really was incredible to sort of see it told through the life of one person, all of those elements of systemic racism. So that's sort of my initial reaction to the book.
Randy.
So my take on this was, here I am as a physician, and what I do every day is I go into a room, shut the door, and see patients one by one who come in for a variety of reasons. And it was the stories I hear, I have this privilege of hearing people's stories. And the parallels between what I hear every day for the residents of Washington, D.C. and George Floyd's story were just incomparable. It's just really amazing to say that this is so many people's story of what life is like. It's complicated, it's hard, and yet the strength of people to like move on the next day and do the next thing is just just inspiring for me every day. And I really appreciated the fact that you took this person's life and explained it in a way that complemented it with the history of what's happening, the policies, that we talk about systemic racism and throw these words around, but this is what it really looks like. This is how it's in day to day, this is how it feels and how we have, as a society, we have really done the wrong thing over and over, and how we can then, now that we recognize that, this is the time to make a change. This is the time to make a real reckoning with what needs to happen next. And we see that the book really did a great job of bringing that all together to make you think, okay, this is a lot of people's story. We have to change that.
I was struck by how many times George Floyd tried.
Yeah.
As he put it, and then you write, tried to get right over and over and over again in his life. Can you talk about that part of his life, just the effort and the striving?
Right. If you're on Twitter, which none of us should be, you might hear, why do we care about George Floyd? He was nothing but a thug. And I think it's good to deconstruct what that's about, right? I think there's unfortunate prejudice in this country when you see someone like George Floyd. I'm sure you see it every day at Bread in the City. Big, muscular, black, poor. You tend to think it's their fault. And that when they come to you and you see them at the worst parts of their life, that they're there because they did not try. That was not George Floyd's story. And he came from a family of strivers. We go back 7 generations in this story. And one of the stories that George was talking about was of his great-great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart, who was the first man to be in his life, the first man in George Floyd's bloodline who was emancipated, who was no longer enslaved. Hillary Thomas Stewart was an industrious man and became one of the wealthiest landowners in North Carolina, owned 500 acres of land, 14 kids. Before he could make one intergenerational transfer, which is how wealth is built in this country, right? That land was taken away from him through complicated tax documents he could not read because he was not allowed to do so. And he died a pauper. His family didn't stop trying, though. They worked under an abusive system of sharecropping, trying to make deals with wealthy white landowners to get by. And at every time, at the end of the year, they were exploited and abused, leaving them with nothing. Larcinia Stewart, George Floyd's mother, left North Carolina to come to Houston, Texas, because she did not think they'd have a chance in North Carolina. So she tried another place. And there they were in a housing project, segregated because the federal government had designed it to be so. It was a red line neighborhood. George Floyd goes into school, and the first dream we know about is of him being a Supreme Court justice. He learns about Thurgood Marshall. He says, this is what I want to do. He writes about it in a second grade essay, which in second grade's not an essay, right? It's about a paragraph.
I was stunned his teacher had it.
Yeah, wasn't that something?
His second grade teacher had this essay and such strong memories that you all elicited from her about a young George Floyd, this child who wanted to grow up to be a Supreme Court justice. I was stunned by that.
And it's not just the dream, right? It's when you look at the essay, the spelling's right, the grammar's right, he's reading at grade level, he's doing math at grade level. So you start to ask yourself, how is it that in a country that you can have a boy who's doing these things, and he was impoverished, so it's really hard to be at grade level. How did he end up with none of those things, right? He was in a system that didn't believe him that he could do it. But they saw that he was big and fast, and they gave him a football and a basketball instead of giving him a textbook, and said, this is the way out of poverty. The irony comes that by the time he gets to college, he becomes really good at football because he had been told all his life, who cares about the books? He's not able to meet the academic requirements, right? And so you start to see the slow building of not just stereotype, but historic policy that had a direct impact on George Floyd's life. And as you grow older, I'm sure you see this in the doctor's office. These things pile up. They add stresses. People look for ways out. They get into, he starts to use, not because he wants to, but because there's not a lot to do. And he starts to have this slow diminution of his dream. But he does something that a lot of black people do in this country. And he did what his mother did, is when he wanted a better life, he moved. He got up and said, I want to get clean. I can't get clean in Texas because they have not expanded Medicaid. I cannot get a job in Texas because I have a felony record. In Texas, at the time, you needed a professional license for 1 in 3 jobs. If you had a felony, you could not get a professional license. So he was out of luck. And so he goes to this place called Minnesota, hoping to become clean, get his life together, and to be able to provide for his daughter. He was there for 3 years before he met Derek Chauvin.
You've touched on this a bit, but I was surprised at the scope of history in this book, and not just the history that you laid out of George Floyd's family, but also the history of the systems that allowed his ancestors' land to be stolen, the systems that you just laid out in Texas that, created an environment where George Floyd could not get a job, and that kept pushing him into crime or pushing him into using. Why was it important for you to weave that into the arc of George Floyd's story?
We wanted to show what it was like. There's one chapter that's called The State of Texas versus George Floyd, which is about a case, but it's really about a state. We wanted to show the idea of what it was like for one person who believed in the American dream, right? George Floyd never believed that something good was not going to happen to him. He always had that belief. But we wanted to show what he was up against, and by extension, what many people of color are up against in this country. So to do that, we had to be able to not think of it as sort of like a chapter textbook. You read something, you say, oh, that was such a long time ago because it was in our textbook. The goal was to be able to show that if you trace these things from the very beginning, the residue of some of these policies continue to inform us today. Not just slavery, right? But how the structures of education funding are structured, how education funding is structured, how housing is structured, how the initial beliefs that African Americans, by nature of being from Africa, are somehow resistant to pain and more likely to lash out. All of these continue to play a key role into how his life is perceived and what George Floyd can do. So what we wanted to do is, we know there's a thing in this country about believing that if you can just pick yourself up by the bootstraps, forget about the past. It was long ago that's the key to having a freer and fairer society. What we wanted to do is challenge the reader to maybe consider that if you actually thought about the history and the residue of these policies and how they're continue to be carried out, and you acknowledged it and you confronted it, maybe you'd have a different understanding.
George, if Robert and Tolu were writing George Floyd versus the non-state of DC, what structures and systems do you think would feed into the way that people, especially Black people, experience life in this city in that way?
Well, I think they would parallel almost exactly. I mean, DC for 250 years oppressed Black people explicitly in terms of the housing that they could have, access to education, access to health care, employment. I mean, to be honest with you, those themes, those systems that have been hostile to Black people have been hostile throughout the country, and DC was no different. And this idea that they have been hostile even in modern times. So you don't have to go back 250 years. You can go back 10 years. You can probably go back 2 years and find policies that Dr. Abramson was talking about, that if someone really thought about the policies, they would see that they're going to affect people of color disproportionately than anybody else. That, the kind of gentrification, for instance, that's playing itself out in DC, that's about to play itself out in Southeast DC, I'm afraid to say, is going to affect Black and brown people. It's going to hurt them. It's going to displace them. And so, yes, when I read this, when I listened to the story, it was the story of every urban area I've ever been around, and I've been to a few. I lived in Los Angeles, DC, Norfolk, Virginia, all sort of urban areas, and they all have that in common, that Black and brown people experience oppressions in all of those systems from the beginning and still up to this day.
Dr. Abramson, as you and I were talking about just before this, there's so much in this book about the impact of all of these policies on Black bodies. The stress that George Floyd was under and how that affected him and his choices, and the way that people treated themselves for the disease that is racism. How do you see that in your work?
So you see that every day. I really appreciated that you kind of elevated that, because it is something I feel like we don't talk enough about. But to live in poverty, to live in a racist society is, it's stressful, but it's the kind of stress that you have day in and day out that creates these high hormone levels, that creates really inflammation in the body everywhere, very unhealthy, and leads to all the diseases that we think about that are more prevalent in African American than they are in the white population. And why would that be? And that's the stress of racism, that whether it has nothing to do necessarily with income, although income is another stressor on itself, but just living in this racist society is the stressor. And that's why we see early heart disease, why we see more high blood pressure and diabetes. And that is the common illnesses that we see in the clinic. The stress of just anxiety and depression, it's real, and it's day in and day out. It's this chronic stress that people of color live under, and that we perpetuate every day. And I was really, it was clear, how do you manage that? And you have to find a way to manage that. And sometimes you just need a way to manage it. And some people will drink, and some people will use drugs, and it's just, there's no other choice at this point. There has to be a way. And if we don't provide a mental health system that helps you find healthier ways to manage it, then this is, of course, it's a natural thing that would happen, and was really well described, I think, in the book of what happened to George Floyd.
And you describe in such vivid detail these panic attacks that he would have in multiple circumstances. Can you talk about some of those and where they came from?
Yeah, to pick up on this, one of the most, I think, telling parts about this tale is that, in Minnesota, George Floyd, he has a girlfriend, she's white, her name's Courtney Ross. They both have substance use issues. Courtney is never stopped by the police. People always try to help her through it. she's given adequate medical care. George Floyd, who is using the same drugs at the same time as Courtney Ross, doesn't experience that, right? Now, it becomes clear that, like so many people, George Floyd, he becomes a man with withered dreams, and he's trying to figure out how to do that. And he's also living with this fear that is common with many people who live in Black households. We all know what the talk is, right? Imagine living in a life where you're constantly thinking any mistake you do is going to wind up with you dead or in prison, right? And also recognize that he's living in a community that is filled with police officers looking to fulfill quotas during the war on drugs and through the 1994 crime bill. Heavy criminal presence, fear that something might happen that will send you to prison or leave you dead. That's just life when you talk about the elevated level of stress, right? As George Floyd continues his life, he starts to talk about having panic attacks, hearing voices. No one believes him. No one believes him on the intake forms when he says that. And then after he goes through prison, remember he's a big guy, he starts having these fits, claustrophobic fits, in which he'd start to breathe heavy, having these panic attacks. And when he gets out, the thing that he fears most is encountering a police officer, because he believes that if he goes back to prison, he'll be back in that cramped cell, or they're going to kill him. And so, in the time that we saw George Floyd, the condition that everyone saw George Floyd, he tells the officer he's claustrophobic. And again, he doesn't believe him, right? He continues going about as if everything's going to be okay.
And I should highlight that this
Yeah.
is before George Floyd is on the ground and they're trying to put him into the squad car. And he's begging them not to because he's claustrophobic and afraid.
Right. And this is not the first time that we had documented that something like this had happened to him. He was highly terrified. When we think about stress, right, and high stress coping, that's kind of like the elevated medical term for what this does, when you have a constant fear in your life. You think about ways to do it, and research looking at how to deal with these stressors in your life. Here's the thing that I just found jaw-dropping. The amount of research that exists looking specifically at culturally informed care for coping and depression and anxiety is practically zero. We talk about it in the book. More than 20 years ago, a study comes out by the federal government that says, we do not know enough about how depression operates within Black men, specifically. It's a problem, we need to find a way to fix it, right? 20 years later, they say, oh, wait, there's nothing being done. And also, we've learned, when we look at this, that Black researchers are white researchers are twice as likely to receive grants than Black researchers. What are the Black researchers trying to study? Inequity, disparities, culturally informed care, things that are happening. So we're seeing this stuff happen within the discussion in the conferences of scientific community, right? Of the scientific community. And there's George Floyd, right? Who is becoming a victim of this crisis, a victim of this lack of knowledge, along with millions of other people, including friends that he have who we also talk to in the book, who are all trying to figure out how to do this thing. But there's little support to figure out how to do it.
Dr. Abramson, do you have thoughts on that yawning gap in the research?
It is, how do things get funded, right? And I feel like it feels like it's little pet projects from somebody somebody in power. So there's somebody on Capitol Hill who has a illness. Who is that person on Capitol Hill? A white person with the power, and they have a relative who has an illness, and that's where they want to fund that project. And so I feel like it's very, or it's the drug companies who are looking for medications who can then will pay as much money as possible to help make money for these projects. So it feels like the way these projects get, who's going to fund the research that's out there is already stacked against, having any kind of funding going towards the real issues of the country or the things that are not being studied. Why are we studying some things over and over again and other things are just left to the side? And there's just a lot that needs to happen.
I want to get to these great questions that we're getting from the audience, and thank you all for that. What was the thinking behind making the title of this book, His Name is George Floyd, instead of His Name was George Floyd?
This is the second time we've received that question. And I was thinking no one would ever ask it. This is actually the subject of very intense debate amongst us. It took us about 2 weeks to decide on a title. But one thing, we wanted to assure that the humanity of George Floyd was what was living and breathing through the text. So thinking about it in a past tense sort of felt weird, right? But the story, a third of the book also looks at the movement that follows his death, because that's a part of his legacy. But it also tries to answer the larger question of, have we made any progress? Did what we learned in the summer after his death do anything to alter our thinking about systemic racism and how to dismantle it? And that part of that struggle was still very much alive. So the was felt like everything was over, but this is a text about a very living, breathing, active time.
Why, at least in the short term, has the story of George Floyd resonated in a way that so many other stories, even similar ones, have not?
Yeah. We talk about this in the book. I think one of the parts has to do with the environment in which we were all living. In May 2020, there was nothing else going on. No sports, you couldn't go out, your schools were at home, your kids were in school, everyone was at home. And so it enabled not just the country, but the world to pay attention to what happened. The second thing has to do with the presence of the video, right? And we've seen video of police violence before, but it's usually pretty grainy. It was a clip. But the citizen video of Darnella Frazier, which is what first started to proliferate around the internet, it was clearer than the body cam. And it also lasted for so long. And I think people saw the metaphor pretty clearly, right? They saw an agent of the state suffocating a person of color while completely ignoring their plea for mercy. And I think anyone in the world who's felt like they weren't being heard understood that. And the third thing was that in those moments, you also saw the humanity of George Floyd. You saw that up until his very last breaths, he was trying to succeed in America in the way his mom told him to. Please, yes, sir. Please help. Someone help. Mom. I think those words really echoed with people because they drew a connection that they had not seen before. And I think it was I think it's sad and unfortunate that it took so many people to see that video, to believe what people of color had been telling them about this country all along. But I think it sort of like it opened a door for us to have these discussions, right? So I think the combination of those things is really what made it stand out.
George, can I ask you to talk about that moment in May of 2020 when this was happening, and what you just said, Robert, this idea that it took this to have some of these conversations. And George, you've been doing this work for a long time. And what was that like for you?
Well, I think that it was the 9 minutes of all the things that to see that murder play out for so long, that I think that was the thing that really shocked the nation. And so even people who were reluctant to think that the state would do those kinds of things, things that black people and many people have known it takes place too often in America and was taking place too often. So that was to me, that's the thing that really got traction, to use a cliche, in the country. But you know, as a black man, I have been pulled out of a car and put on the ground myself. It is unfortunately an experience that too many black men have had, and know that. And so I really have felt the fear of not knowing what was going to happen in the time that between when I was pulled out of the car and put on the ground and finally allowed to leave. And so I guess traumatizing, to be honest with you, is the word that comes to mind, is, or re-traumatizing, to sort of witness that. It was why the book was hard to listen to again. It's why looking at it on TV was difficult then. It's why I still have emotion in my voice when I think about that. The other thing I would say about George Floyd and the experience of black men is I feel that we are being locked out of society. I think that's what I see every day here in D.C., particularly when I'm working out of our Southeast Washington, D.C. office. I see black men, young and old, just all on the street, clearly locked out of the economic systems that people use to live their lives in this country. And I'm sure they have stories, unfortunately, that are again sort of similar to George Floyd's story, and some have aged to the point where they've gone beyond the time when they can be sort of get back into the system, get a job, be a part of everyday sort of inclusion. But there are young people over in Southeast that are like that too, and it's just, and nobody's, and here's the piece that's important. Dr. Abramson was alluding to this. And it doesn't feel like anybody, and Breakfast City is trying to do it, but it doesn't really feel like anybody has even noticed. Forget trying to do something really about it in this city. It is just allowed to go on every day. I drive down Good Hope Road, and I just see that, and it's like, wow, scores of people just on the streets, locked out of the society. And one of the things I'll say, and when I see construction jobs and things playing itself out in the street, they're not black people in those jobs, in their own neighborhoods. It's just something we have to interrupt, we have to deal with, because it is, it's going to create sort of unrealized dreams, just like the one that George Floyd had unrealized.
Robert, you touched on this, but one of our audience members also wants to follow up. You mentioned the video and how it spread and it went so viral. What is your opinion on the role of social media in the Black Lives Matter movement? For example, Derek Chauvin used restraint, as you lay out in your book, multiple times, but we didn't know. I mean, I guess some people knew, but the broader country did not know until George Floyd's murder. Do you think that social media in general is playing a positive role in showing injustice?
This comes to the person who just made the crack about Twitter. I mean, we spend a good amount of time with Derek Chauvin and the history of his police precinct, the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, in the story because we think it's important for people to understand that just systemic racism isn't just a thing that affects Black people. Derek Chauvin and his cohort in his police precinct are also operating and are also believing and falling prey to that same residue. They have power, though. And some in the story we go through a number of times, we documented at least 9 instances in which Derek Chauvin used a neck restraint, which is some way of interrupting a suspect's breathing. And many of those happened with a body cam. So you have to ask, including one incident with a teenager in which he kneeled on his neck for more than 13 minutes. The teenager survived because he was a teenager. And that was recorded. You sort of have to ask yourself, did no one watch the recording? Why wasn't there an investigation?
Did you watch it?
No, it wasn't available to me. So, why wasn't there, right? That's the question. It's also true that when George Floyd had died, the Minneapolis Police Department said, nothing to see here. There was an unruly man. He had a medical incident. There are no weapons used. Everyone, let's move on. If that video had not surfaced, the course of history would have been changed significantly, right? So what role does social media play? It is unfortunately a public accountability standard that exists in a society in which civilian accountability, there's an oversight board in Minneapolis, there's a group that's supposed to help people, of regular people, that's supposed to help the city decide whether or not the police are acting strangely, does not work. And so it's an unfortunately common last resort, but had it not been for social media, this would have looked very differently. And we know that not just because of Derek Chauvin, but after George Floyd is murdered, we get to meet a host of other people in the Twin Cities in Minnesota who've lost their loved ones to police officers under dubious practices. And none of them got a lawyer. There was no social media then, even though some of them were witness to the injustice that was inflicted on their son. Nothing happened. Those cases were thrown out. So the camera and the power of the camera has become a very powerful tool for the powerless.
Well, and the social media organizing that happened during the pandemic online.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, sorry. And you cannot leave that out of it. I'm glad you resurrected it. Because it is really like the movement of dedicated, super smart, savvy people who are able to get the world to care and also to connect it. We go through the book, like the discussions about how this story related to the Aboriginal community in Australia and to the Black community in Britain. And that happened because you had super savvy people who knew how to use the technology. And before any public official had ever named George Floyd as the victim, the community in Minneapolis had already named him and already said what happened. It was their word against the police departments, and the people on social media were right.
That leads perfectly to this next question from our audience, what are your thoughts on the lessons and arguments regarding the role of police in our society? After doing all of this reporting, George Floyd is just one of many examples of police escalating non-capital offenses to capital punishment.
Yeah. What we know about the police departments that we researched, right, is they fell into very human instincts. You know, if you're left to your own devices and nobody's watching you and no one's trying to execute discipline, people take advantage of the situation. That's what you saw with Derek Chauvin's police precinct in particular, right? One of the things that, as we alluded to, that I had learned through this, being in a very skeptical field, right, is like you have to listen to a community, right? Because oftentimes the way the community is framing a story is accurate, it's true. They're not trying to spin you or lie to you. They're trying to join you in that purpose. And so it feels to me that when it comes to discussions about policing, one, it's clear there's an accountability problem. Two, it's clear through the reporting that the solutions should come from a community. They shouldn't come from a journalist.
Okay, community. What do you think?
Well, the other point the book makes about police is that, policing in America, in a lot of ways, was born out of slavery. Particularly in the South, that the police forces were created post the Civil War to deal with, and to some degree post Reconstruction, to deal with the fact that black people were now free to try to sort of live a free life, to try to sort of make a life for them and their families. And so the police, so the thing that I think about it when I think about the story and about that narrative is that, so the police were weaponized from the beginning of sort of the freedom of blacks in this country, and have really been an instrument, an intentional instrument all along, the following 100, almost 200 years later, to keep black people in check, to criminalize them, and so in a lot of ways, and we talk about this in the racial justice movement, is that a lot of what we see today is a part of the DNA of the entire country's history around policy and institutions, that it really just transformed to be sort of a modernized version of what police were originally intended to do. So that's a really important piece. But the other piece that is important to me is, and I say this sometimes with a lot of pushback from people, but in many ways, it's the other institutions that kill black people a lot more frequently than the police do. And those institutions have also have a history that was designed, people talk about black people and the sort of difficulty we've had with the educational system. Well, this country spent 200 to 300 years literally trying to keep black people from getting educated. And so the last 60 or so years, when we, in theory, had a chance to sort of really get an education, we get criticized and characterized as people who can't be educated, who don't succeed. This is a country that intentionally suppressed the opportunity for black people to get educated for centuries. And you can look at almost every other institution and find a historical sort of lineage that has caused a lot, I believe that's caused a lot of the early deaths that black people experience. And we know that black people in D.C., black men died 10, 15, 20, almost 20 years earlier than white people. And I believe that it's those institutions and their lineage that it continues to sort of operate today in ways that are more insidious, seem supposedly less intentional, but they play themselves out and still have these lethal results in this city. I think about all the gun violence that people talk about. It's a horrific thing. But again, black people are dying from a lot more than guns. The gun violence is sensational and it's horrific, and we all think we need to do something about it. But at Breath of the City, we worry about people who are dying from the food insecurity and for the lack of access to the basic things that everybody needs to have a healthy life. And so that's what triggers for me this police thing, the history of policing, but also the other institutions that really conspire to shorten black lives in this country.
Dr. Abramson, in the book, the authors, you, talk about this sometimes overly cozy relationship between the medical community and police, particularly when it comes to medical examiners' offices and even just treatment of diseases and what conditions someone is in. I wonder, within the medical community, have you heard a change in narrative about how the medical community interacts with the police in the wake of all of this?
So where I do hear conversations about this is really from students, and it's this next generation, I think, of students who are coming up or saying, like, this is not the world that we want, and we need to do things differently. And I think they look at the systems that are there and are ready to take a new stand and push back. And it's really very powerful and great to see. But clearly, the healthcare system is very much entrenched with all the systems. They're not to be separated out in any way. Some of it is just implicit bias that people have, and some of it is like out and out, clearly there for a reason to perpetuate the system that we have. So I'm hoping that things will change. I don't see major changes happening now. I think people are at least starting to have the conversations, probably in some places, but not at the level that it needs to happen, at like larger institutions. I'm talking about hospitals. I'm talking about like nothing, like maybe small clinics are thinking about this, but not larger institutions. Schools are starting to think about this because students push back. But the prison system and that healthcare system that works together there, the medical examiner's office, who works with the police department, I don't see any real conversation happening there yet.
One of the other things that the book talks about is one of the sort of disheartening things, but I think it's real, is that potentially the window is closing on sort of the wokeness, if you will, of people who are not people of color. And I've had that concern in recent months, that it was really evidence that people, that window, if you will, was closing. And one of the things I remember, one of the groups who I've gone through racial equity training to talk to and said that's really important, and I'm saying this as much for the white people in the audience as anybody else, is that it's easy for white people to walk away from this work. You can walk away from it and probably not, have a life that's any different. Black people can't do that. We can't walk away from this work. We can't walk away from the reality that it is life or death for us. And so when I saw that in the book, I both agreed and sort of felt, some kind of way about that fact.
I think, the difference is toward the end of the book between the way Joe Biden talks about the situation compared with the black people in the book. I mean, it's stunning, and it really resonates with me, because I think that's the issue, right? The perpetual question is, how can you reach a fairer society in a world in which you have one group of people, largely white people, who still want to debate about the nuances of whether something's racist or whether it's too shameful to talk about. And you have another group of people, largely black people, but not just, who say, if you don't do this today, my child might be next. My kid might be next. And so like you're dealing with the theoretical idea, the academic discussion, and the very real loss of life. I mean, I had never considered the relationship between the medical examiner and the police department before.
I hadn't until I read your book.
Yeah, and then you start to think about, well, if you have a system where one is kind of constantly like supporting the other, what happens when one messes up? I mean, there were studies that showed 1 in 5 medical examiners felt pressured to change their diagnosis of what happened because a city official asked them to. Can you imagine? And also that for the people who are prosecuting the case, they thought the masterstroke was to not use the medical examiner as the chief medical official to say what happened to George Floyd, because they worried that he might say something he told investigators, which was, if he did not have a knee on his neck, he might have died of a drug overdose, right? But what does that, why would you say that? It's like, if I did not have a tractor hit me, I might have died from talking too much. So I mean, that's the sort of thing that continuously happens. And it's interesting how quickly that conversation sprang up and how quickly it faded away.
We have one more question to get through, but before we conclude, I do want to take a moment to thank our headliners, co-team leaders, Donna Leinwan-Leger and Lori Russo, as well as our club membership director, Kate Helster, who was over there but moved someplace else, and our club executive director, Bill McCarron, who I do see over there. Oh, you were just behind the podium, sorry. And just as a reminder, if you have not purchased the book yet, we will have copies for sale outside on your way out, and we might be able to get you to sign them. We can at least ask. And before I forget, I do want to present Robert, George, and Dr. Randy with our press club mugs as a token of our thanks for being with us this evening. You can pass them down.
Yeah.
I should tell you, these are very special mugs.
Yeah, they look very special.
Yes. So in our last few minutes, just very quickly, I'd love to hear from each of you the answer to this last question from our audience. Do you believe we're headed in the right direction in the fight against systemic racism?
Well, the people who know me hear me say this often, a quote that I love, which is, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I believe that still, despite what we see sometimes from day to day. So yes, I think things are getting better, because I think that that's what happens, is that we, with each generation, move the needle on the issue of racism and oppression, not fast enough. And I hope that, when we hand it over to the next generation of leaders in this work, that they move the needle even more. I think they will.
So it's hard to be hopeful. It's hard to be hopeful, but I think we have no choice. We have no choice. We have to work hard to make it get better. So even though you feel like nothing changes, and sometimes we feel like one step back and one step forward, 2 steps back, it's very frustrating and hard, but we must be hopeful, and we must believe that we can't stop working on it, and we have to keep pushing, and that's it. We just have to have hope.
Yeah. The last chapter of the book talks about this. It talks about hope feeling like the ultimate American defense mechanism, right? To traffic in something different feels really bleak. I want to say before we leave, we've talked about a lot of hard things here. And Tolu and I, we're very self-conscious about not just presenting a narrative of Black pain and exploitation, because that's not the full story. And within the pages, right, you see I think, just the gregariousness and the striving of George Floyd himself, just as a person navigating the system, reminds me of something you were talking about earlier, Doctor, in terms of the power and the honor and the privilege it is when someone shares their story. People shared their stories with us, more than 400. Not just because it was sad and we wanted the world to be sad. They shared it because they were persistent and they wanted the world to join them in that persistence to create a better society and to create a better place. So when we look at things, one of the chapter opens with a conversation with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And Reverend Jackson, who's in the twilight of his life, I'm sitting with him, and I've just seen the Floyd family be knocked over by the legislative process and trying to get this police reform bill done. I'm thinking about just how frustrating it's been to see some changes. 16 states passed bans on no-knock warrants or chokeholds, but definitely a small fraction of what people thought would happen. And I thought to myself, well, geez, if they're being disheartened, what does someone like Jesse Jackson think? Because he was the same age as Emmett Till. And so I asked him, how do you actually keep hope alive? And he said something similar to what you were saying, George. He was saying, you have to look from the beginning. And when you look at where we are, there's still reason to believe that we can keep going. And so it's not the matter of whether we're headed in the right direction, although Reverend Jackson would unequivocally say we are. It's whether or not you have the power and the persistence to keep going. That's what George Floyd had. That's what his family continues to have. And that's what we hope people who read the book end up having too.
Well, I was incredibly grateful and honored to meet George Floyd through your words. I left this feeling like I know him, and he seemed like a wonderful person. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
That's it for us. Welcome. Thank you, everyone. Again, if you haven't had a chance, definitely read it.
It's a great book.